The noise woke me before the sun did. Engines. Not tractors, not trucks. Heavy machinery tearing into dirt that had been quiet the night before. I ran outside and froze. Floodlights lit up my pasture like a crime scene. Graders were carving a long, straight strip through my field, and overhead a small plane was already circling low, lining up like it expected to land. I started yelling, waving my arms, heart slamming in my chest as neighbors gathered along the road filming on their phones. Near the machine stood the HOA board leader, calm as ever, hands folded like this was all perfectly normal. I called the sheriff on the spot. 2 deputies showed up, walked the land with me, and I felt that rush of relief until the HOA leader pulled out an old yellow document and handed it to them. He spoke softly, apologetically, about a decades-old easement, about shared emergency access. The deputies read it, sighed, and told me they couldn't do anything. Civil matter. Court issue. Then they left. As the engine started back up and the plane dipped lower, it hit me all at once. This wasn't just an HOA overstepping. They weren't just trespassing. They were using fake paperwork to force something dangerous into existence. And whatever they were building out here, it was already far beyond neighborhood drama. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I bought the farm because it was the opposite of everything loud. No traffic hum. No neighbors peering over fences. Just open land, old trees, and the kind of quiet that makes you sleep deeper without realizing it. I wanted privacy, space for my family, and a place where nothing happened unless we chose for it to happen. The seller was honest, the deed was clean, and the land had been used the same way for generations. Nothing fancy, nothing shared. For the first year, that promise held. The surrounding community was small and rural, mostly people who wanted the same thing I did. We waved when we passed each other. We minded our own business. Then the HOA showed up, not with a bang, but with a smile. It started as planning meetings, flyers about protecting property values and preparing for future growth. The tone was gentle, almost reassuring. They weren't demanding anything yet. Just talking, just listening. At least that's what they said. The board leader introduced himself early on. Polished, friendly, the kind of man who spoke like he'd taken a seminar on conflict resolution. He shook my hand and told me how lucky I was to own land like mine. He said it had real potential, which I took as a compliment at the time. He asked a lot of questions, though. How many acres? Whether the ground stayed firm year-round? If I'd ever considered leasing part of it, I told him no. Politely, firmly. After that, the conversations didn't stop, but they changed. Every interaction came with a layer of concern wrapped around it. He'd mentioned safety, emergency access. What would happen if an ambulance couldn't reach someone fast enough? He framed everything like he was thinking about families, not plans. If I hesitated, he'd tilt his head and smile and say he understood how change could feel overwhelming. Then the survey flags appeared. Small, bright markers popped up near my fence line and across the far end of the pasture. When I asked about them, I was told they were part of a community land assessment. Nothing official, nothing binding. Just information gathering. I removed a few, and they were replaced the next morning. The HOA meetings grew more frequent. The language grew vaguer. Future growth. Shared benefit. Infrastructure readiness. No one ever said exactly what they meant, but everyone acted like it was already decided. I stopped attending after the board leader introduced a slide labeled long-term access corridors and gestured vaguely in the direction of my land. The first letter arrived shortly after. It referenced an easement agreement from nearly 50 years ago. The wording was dense, legal enough to sound convincing if you didn't know what you were reading. It claimed a right of limited access for emergency purposes and suggested the HOA was merely exercising that right. It didn't ask for permission. It informed me of intent. That's when I called the sheriff for the first time. And that's when the HOA produced the document in person, calmly, confidently, knowing exactly what it would do. Watching the deputies read it and step back was the moment I realized the trap. The paper didn't need to be real. It only needed to be complicated enough to freeze enforcement. After that, things moved quickly. Contractors started showing up, not every day, just often enough to normalize their presence. When I confronted one, he said he was following HOA instructions and showed me a work order that referenced approved access. Everyone pointed somewhere else. No one took responsibility. At home, I started pulling records. Old plats, county filings, historical easements. The document they were waving around was a distortion at best, a forgery at worst. It had been twisted far beyond its original intent, inflated into something it was never meant to be. But undoing that would take months in civil court, and they knew it. What unsettled me most was how careful they were being. Not reckless. Not loud. Strategic. They were moving just fast enough to create momentum, just slow enough to claim good faith. Every interaction was designed to make me look unreasonable if I pushed too hard. I didn't talk about my background to anyone. Out here, it wasn't relevant. I was just another landowner. But as I watched the pattern form, I recognized it instantly. This was how people behaved when they thought oversight didn't apply to them, when they believed distance equaled immunity. The final confirmation came by accident. I was fueling up in town when two men at the next pump started talking about the HOA. They weren't whispering. They were excited. One of them joked about how clever it was to use old paperwork to get things started. The other mentioned pilots already lined up, eager for a private landing spot away from regulated airfields. I didn't move. I didn't react. I just listened. That was when everything snapped into focus. The markers, the grading, the language about access. This wasn't about roads or emergency vehicles. It never had been. The HOA wasn't planning something small. They were already talking to private pilots. The next letter wasn't polite. It was taped to my gate like a warning notice, printed on thick paper with the HOA seal in language that sounded confident enough to scare someone who didn't know better. It stated that the association was formally exercising its right to emergency access across my property under the easement referenced previously. It claimed my cooperation was expected and that interference could result in daily fines. I drove straight to the back pasture. That was when I saw what they'd already done. Two graders were parked just beyond the tree line, angled like they belonged there. The grass had been flattened into a long, unnaturally straight strip, wide enough that my stomach dropped the moment I saw it. At the far end, partially hidden behind a portable shed, were metal drums stenciled with hazard markings. I didn't need to get close to know what they were. Aviation fuel. I stood there longer than I should have, just staring, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with how casually they were acting about it. This wasn't preparation. This wasn't access. This was construction. Deliberate, measured, and already well underway. I called the HOA board leader and told him to come to the property. When he arrived, he didn't look surprised. He didn't even look annoyed. He walked the strip with his hands in his pockets, nodding as if he were inspecting progress on a project he personally approved. When I told him they were trespassing and that the equipment and fuel needed to be removed immediately, he didn't argue. He smiled, slow and patient. "Look," he said, lowering his voice like he was trying to calm a child. "I know this feels aggressive, but we're not taking anything from you. We're improving it. This kind of infrastructure increases value across the board. Yours included." I told him fuel storage without permits was dangerous. I told him the easement didn't allow this. I told him I was calling authorities again. He sighed, genuinely sounding tired. "You can," he said, "but they're going to tell you the same thing. This is civil now. And dragging it out in court just hurts everyone, especially you." Don't be the neighbor who stalls progress for families who just want safety. Then he warned me about fines, about liens, about how quickly non-compliance could become expensive. The threat was wrapped in concern, delivered with a smile. By the end of the week, the pressure spread outward. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to before started stopping by, not to ask questions, but to make statements. One told me the HOA had explained everything and that I was misunderstanding the situation. Another said emergency access could save a life someday and asked how I'd feel if my refusal caused a tragedy. My wife was cornered at the grocery store by someone who said we were holding the whole community hostage. At night, trucks came and went. Lights burned late. The sound of grating echoed across the land long after dark. I found new tire tracks cutting through fencing. One of my cattle came up injured after brushing against exposed metal near the strip. When I checked the security cameras, the footage skipped for nearly an hour. Clean cut, no glitch. Inside the house, the mood shifted. My kids asked why strangers were walking near the barn. My wife started locking doors she'd never locked before. She asked me, quietly, if this was going to get worse. I told her I didn't know yet. The realization hit me standing alone at the far end of the field one evening, watching the sun drop behind the trees. I walked the length of the flattened strip slowly, counting my steps without meaning to. The width was precise. The alignment was deliberate. The surface had been compacted evenly, not like a road, but like something that needed consistency. This wasn't emergency access. It was a runway. And they weren't pretending otherwise anymore. The next notice confirmed it. This one wasn't taped up. It was hand-delivered, slipped into a clear sleeve like something important. It referenced aviation-related safety improvements and warned that any obstruction could be reported as a hazard. The language was colder now, less friendly, less patient. At the bottom, underlined, was a single phrase that made my jaw tighten. For aviation safety. That was when I stopped pushing back publicly. If I shut them down now, it stayed small. Trespassing. Civil penalties. A long court fight they could stall for years behind that fake easement. They'd pay a fine, maybe restore some grass, and move on to the next scheme. But if they attempted a landing, that changed everything. Unauthorized runway operations. Improper fuel handling. No environmental clearance. No airspace coordination. No safety plan. It crossed from nuisance into federal felony territory. Intent mattered. And they were handing me proof with every email, every notice, every night they kept building. So I went quiet. No more confrontations. No more calls. I let them believe the pressure worked. I let them believe I was tired. Every piece of equipment they brought in, every radio transmission they made, every threat they documented was another nail in a case they didn't even realize they were building for me. They thought I was trapped by paperwork. What they didn't understand was that they'd just given me something far more dangerous than authority. They'd given me timing. Once I stopped arguing, they got bolder. The work shifted almost entirely tonight. As soon as the sun dipped behind the trees, floodlights snapped on and washed my fields in harsh white glare. The quiet I'd bought the farm for was gone, replaced by the grinding of steel against dirt, backup alarms chirping endlessly, engines idling for hours at a time. Even inside the house, the vibrations hummed through the floorboards like a warning you couldn't escape. They didn't hide anymore. Trucks rolled in openly, crews moved with confidence, like people who believed the land was already theirs. When I walked the fence line, no one stopped working. A few men glanced at me, expressionless, then went back to what they were doing. Once, a pickup followed me slowly as I walked back toward the house, headlights off until the last few seconds. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't meant to be. The HOA board leader sent another email, this one carefully worded and almost cheerful. He attached documents claiming county approval for temporary aviation-related access. I opened them and felt a cold calm settle in. The seals were wrong. The formatting didn't match county standards. One page referenced a department that had been dissolved years earlier. Another used language that sounded official but said nothing of substance. It was the kind of paperwork meant to intimidate, not withstand scrutiny. I called the county anyway. After multiple transfers, I reached someone who sounded exhausted before I even finished explaining. She told me it was a civil issue. When I pointed out the fuel storage and aviation activity, she hesitated, then said she couldn't find anything in their system, but that the HOA had submitted materials. Her advice was to resolve it privately or through the courts. The call ended with polite dismissal. Things started breaking after that. One of my cattle came back limping, a deep cut along its side from exposed metal, left near the graded strip. Another animal refused to go near the water trough closest to the construction, spooked by the lights and noise. A section of fencing collapsed overnight, tire tracks cutting straight through it. When I checked the security cameras, there was a clean gap in the footage, nearly an hour missing without explanation. Inside the house, the tension crept into everything. My wife stopped letting the kids play outside after sunset. She double-checked doors. She asked me, quietly, whether we should leave for a few days. I told her not yet, but the truth was, I didn't like how careful she'd become. This place was supposed to make us feel safe, not hunted. Neighbors started choosing sides. Some avoided us entirely, crossing the street or pretending not to see me. Others confronted me openly. One man accused me of blocking emergency medical access. Another said the HOA had explained everything and that I was being unreasonable. A woman told my wife at the store that if someone died because of my stubbornness, it would be on our conscience. None of them mentioned permits. None of them mentioned legality. They repeated the same talking points, word for word, like they'd been rehearsed. The intimidation sharpened. A notice appeared nailed to my barn door listing violations I'd never agreed to, fines calculated per day in amounts designed to frighten, not enforce. The language had lost all pretense of cooperation. This wasn't about compromise anymore. It was about pressure. Then came the announcement. The HOA circulated a community-wide message praising significant progress and thanking everyone for their patience. Buried in the middle was a single line that made my pulse slow instead of spike. They had scheduled a test landing. A private aircraft, a light plane, flown by what they called a community partner. The date and time were listed plainly, like a dinner reservation. They framed it as a milestone. I stood at the edge of the strip that evening, watching crews finish smoothing the surface under the lights. The alignment was unmistakable now. The width, the length, the approach path cleared just enough to be dangerous. This wasn't improvised, it was calculated. They weren't hiding because they believed the paperwork, fake as it was, had already protected them. That night, the HOA board leader emailed me directly. The tone was friendly, almost warm. He thanked me for my understanding and said he was glad we could move forward without unnecessary conflict. He reminded me that interference on the scheduled day could be interpreted as creating a safety hazard and said he hoped we could all enjoy the moment together. He signed it with his full name and title. I read it twice and didn't reply. If I stopped them now, it would stay what it had always been in their minds, a property dispute. Trespass, civil court. Years of motions and delays while they claimed good faith and blamed contractors. They'd lose some money and learn nothing. But a landing attempt changed the category entirely. An unauthorized aircraft approaching an unapproved runway wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a violation with teeth. Add fuel mishandling, falsified approvals, and documented intent, and it crossed into territory no amount of smiling concern could soften. So I let them finish. I documented every light they installed incorrectly, every radio transmission on the wrong frequency, every email that framed legality as an inconvenience instead of a boundary. I watched them grow more confident, more public, more careless. The night before the landing, my wife packed a small bag and took the kids to stay with family. She didn't argue. She didn't ask questions. She just hugged me longer than usual and said she trusted me. Alone in the house, I listened to the machinery shut down one by one. The floodlights flickered, then steadied, illuminating a runway that should never have existed. Just before sunrise, another message went out from the HOA, cheerful and bold, reminding everyone that the test landing would happen that morning. They encouraged attendance. They encouraged celebration. I stepped outside as the sky lightened to that familiar gray-blue, the same color it had been the morning this all began. In the distance, I could already hear the faint hum of an approaching engine. The plane's arrival time had been announced. I didn't sleep that night, but not because I was afraid. Fear had burned off days ago. What replaced it was focus. I sat at the kitchen table long after the house went quiet, laptop open, documents spread out in careful piles, the fake easement. The HOA emails, screenshots of their announcements, photos of fuel drums sitting bare in dry grass, audio clips of radio chatter bleeding across frequencies they had no right to touch. When you've done this work long enough, you stop seeing chaos and start seeing patterns. And the pattern here was unmistakable. I'd spent years as a senior FAA compliance official, the person people never thought about until something went very wrong. My job had never been dramatic. No flashing lights, no shouting. Just audits, investigations, and long, methodical reports that ended careers and shut down operations people thought were invisible. I'd walked illegal airstrips carved into farmland, deserts, wetlands, even rooftops. Every time, the people behind them thought distance meant safety. That rural meant unregulated. They were always wrong. The HOA had made the same mistake. The moment I realized that, everything shifted. I stopped seeing myself as someone under attack and started seeing them as a case study unfolding in real time. Every night of construction, every patronizing email, every announcement meant to shame me into silence was evidence. They weren't just careless. They were confident, and confidence makes people sloppy. I began documenting with intention. I measured the strip properly, noting length, width, grade, and alignment. I recorded the approach path and overlaid it with airspace data, highlighting obstacles they'd ignored and clearances they'd never requested. I cataloged the lighting, amateurishly spaced and improperly angled. I photographed fuel storage from every side, documenting lack of grounding, containment, and fire mitigation. I logged dates and times. I preserved metadata, nothing emotional. Nothing dramatic, just clean, boring facts. That's what destroys people like this: boredom. The email sealed it. It came from the HOA board leader to a contractor, forwarded accidentally to a general mailing list before being quickly recalled. He admitted casually that they knew the runway wasn't permitted yet, but believed once the first landing happened, enforcement would be politically inconvenient. He joked that regulators didn't care about middle-of-nowhere farms and said the worst-case scenario was a fine they could absorb. Intent matters. And he put it in writing. I forwarded that email along with everything else I'd collected. No commentary, no explanation. Just a subject line with coordinates and a single sentence stating that an unauthorized runway operation was imminent. The response didn't come immediately. It didn't need to. The next morning, my phone rang once. The voice on the other end didn't introduce itself. It didn't have to. He asked if the documentation was complete. I said yes. He asked if the landing was scheduled. I confirmed the date and time. There was a pause, then a quiet acknowledgement. Let it proceed, he said. Do not interfere. That instruction wasn't casual. It was deliberate. If I stopped them now, the HOA would retreat behind paperwork and claim confusion. Trespass. Civil fines. Years of litigation where they pretended ignorance and painted themselves as well-meaning volunteers. The fake easement would muddy the waters just enough to slow everything down. But if an aircraft attempted to land, that crossed a line no civil court could blur. Unauthorized runway operations weren't just violations. They were felonies. Add falsified documents and environmental hazards, and the case hardened instantly. They wouldn't be able to plead misunderstanding. They wouldn't be able to spin intent. They would be done, so I stayed quiet. When the HOA board leader sent another message thanking me for my cooperation, I didn't respond. When neighbors asked if I was coming to the landing event, I said we had other plans. When construction crews worked through the night, I didn't step outside. Silence wasn't surrender. It was camouflage. Behind the scenes, the coordination continued. Evidence was reviewed. Jurisdiction was confirmed. Enforcement authority was established. No one rushed. No one panicked. The process was slow, precise, and irreversible. That night, my wife packed a small bag and took the kids to stay with family. She didn't need details. She just needed to know it would end. I hugged them and watched their car disappear down the road, the sound of tires fading into quiet. Alone again, I walked the length of the strip one final time. The lights flicked on in sequence, wrong but functional. The surface was smooth enough to fool someone who didn't know what to look for. The hazards were everywhere if you did. I didn't feel satisfaction, just resolve. I went back inside and sent one last message confirming the timeline. The reply came back short and unemotional. Operation confirmed. I closed the laptop and sat there in the dark, listening to the distant hum of preparation outside. They thought the hard part was over. They thought they'd won. They had no idea. The only thing left to do was wait. The FAA enforcement operation was quietly set in motion. The days leading up to the landing felt unnaturally calm, and that calm told me more than any threat ever could. When people think they're winning, they stop checking their work. They stop whispering. They start celebrating early. Publicly, I disappeared. I didn't send emails. I didn't show up at the fence line. I didn't confront crews or question contractors. If anyone was watching, it looked like the pressure had finally worked, like I'd accepted the paperwork and backed down. That illusion mattered. Arrogance needs an audience, and silence feeds it. Privately, I kept documenting. I logged radio traffic first. Handheld aviation radios crackled to life every evening, sloppy and casual, operators using improper frequencies and unregistered call signs. I recorded timestamps, noted who was speaking, and preserved the audio cleanly. Unauthorized coordination isn't a gray area. It's a line, and they crossed it repeatedly. Next came the airspace violations. I mapped their intended approach path and overlaid it against existing airspace data. The problems stacked immediately. No published approach, no obstacle analysis. Trees and fencing inside the safety envelope. Power lines unmarked and unlit. The glide slope they'd cleared was just barely wide enough to be tempting and just dangerous enough to be lethal. I recorded everything from legal vantage points, careful not to step out of bounds myself. I wasn't going to give anyone an excuse to muddy the record. Fuel handling was worse. The drum sat exposed, ungrounded, too close to the strip and too close to dry grass. There were no spill berms, no fire suppression equipment within a safe radius, no environmental containment of any kind. After a light rain, I photographed runoff channels forming in the dirt. The soil darkened in ways it shouldn't have been. One bad landing. One hot engine. One careless spark. The risk wasn't hypothetical. It was immediate. Each night, I compiled everything into clean files. Boring file names. Neutral descriptions. No adjectives. No commentary. Enforcement doesn't need outrage. It needs clarity. Meanwhile, the HOA got louder. They announced an inaugural landing event in a message blasted to the entire community. The language was triumphant. Vision realized. Progress achieved. They thanked members for standing firm against misinformation and invited everyone to attend. There would be refreshments. A short speech. Photos. They wanted witnesses. They wanted legitimacy. The board leader signed it personally. Neighbors who had avoided us before suddenly acted friendly again. A few waved when they drove past. One stopped to ask if we'd be watching the landing. I told him we had plans. He nodded like that made sense, already mentally filing the event as a success. I let it happen. Every announcement they made, every message they sent, every instruction they gave to contractors was another layer of proof. They weren't being dragged into this. They were proud of it. They were coordinating openly, convinced that the fake easement and the sheriff's earlier retreat had insulated them from anything serious. Behind the scenes, the briefings were already underway. I wasn't present for most of them, and I didn't need to be. My role was finished. The evidence spoke for itself. Federal reviewers confirmed what I already knew. No permits, no environmental clearance, no airspace authorization, forged county documents. Clear intent to proceed anyway. The words that came back to me were precise and unemotional. Multiple felony violations confirmed. Jurisdiction established. Enforcement authorized. From that point on, my instructions were simple. Stay quiet. Be present on landing day. Do not interfere. That was harder than it sounded. My family felt the tension even without the details. My wife packed an overnight bag and took the kids to stay with relatives the night before the landing. Not because she expected chaos, but because she no longer trusted the judgment of people who believed rules were optional. I didn't argue. I hugged them longer than usual and watched their taillights disappear down the road. Alone in the house, I listened to the final preparations outside. Trucks arrived and left. Lights were tested again. Someone ran the strip one last time, smoothing imperfections that wouldn't save them. I watched from the window, not with anger, but with the detached awareness of someone watching a recording whose ending was already written. Just before dawn, my phone buzzed once. Confirmed. I stepped outside as the sky shifted to that pale gray blue, the same color it had been the morning this all began. The runway lights flicked on in sequence, uneven but bright. Cars started to gather along the road. Neighbors arrived with coffee cups and phones. The HOA board leader stood near the midpoint of the strip, relaxed, smiling, already rehearsing whatever speech he planned to give. Far off in the distance, barely audible at first, came the sound of an approaching engine. I didn't look at the plane, I looked at the timing. Everything was in place, every violation documented, every decision recorded in their own words. The trap wasn't sprung yet, but it was set so tightly there was no way out. Landing day had arrived. By the time the sun cleared the tree line, the farm felt less like a home and more like a venue. Cars lined the road in uneven rows, doors slamming as neighbors stepped out with coffee cups and phones already recording. Folding tables had been dragged into the grass. Someone had hung a banner between two stakes that read, "A new chapter for our community." Laughter drifted across the field, light and careless, the kind you hear when people think the hard part is already over. The HOA board leader moved through the crowd like a host greeting guests at his own event. He shook hands, nodded, smiled, stopped for photos. Confidence radiated off him. When he spotted me standing near the fence, he changed direction and walked straight over. "I'm glad you came," he said, loud enough for people nearby to hear. "It means a lot when folks can put aside personal discomfort for the greater good." I didn't respond. That didn't slow him down. He turned slightly, angling his body so others could hear. "This is what progress looks like," he continued, gesturing behind him toward the strip. "Sometimes it's uncomfortable for a few people at first. But in the long run, everyone benefits." A couple of neighbors nodded. Someone murmured agreement. Phones tilted toward me, waiting. He leaned in just a little, voice still calm, still reasonable. "I know change can feel threatening when you don't understand it," he said. "But we've been transparent. We've done our due diligence. This is happening." I kept my eyes on the field. That seemed to irritate him. He cleared his throat and raised his voice another notch. "Let this be a lesson," he said, smiling thinly. "That one person doesn't get to hold a whole community hostage." A few people clapped. Not many, but enough. Then the sound reached us. Low. Steady. Unmistakable. Heads tilted upward almost in unison. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The plane appeared as a dark shape against the brightening sky, small but growing fast. Someone cheered. Another person started counting down, like this was a fireworks show. The board leader's smile widened. He stepped closer to the center of the strip, hands on his hips, chest out. This was his moment. The plane descended, lining up with the runway. Even from the ground, the approach looked wrong. Too fast, too shallow. The engine pitch wavered slightly as the pilot adjusted. I felt my pulse pick up despite myself, a familiar instinct kicking in, quiet but insistent. Around me, no one noticed. Phones were raised higher. Someone shouted encouragement. Dust began to lift from the ground as the prop wash skimmed the surface. The board leader raised his arms, waving like he could guide the aircraft in himself. I didn't look at him. I watched the approach path, then let my gaze drift past it, toward the far end of the road beyond the fence. I counted silently, not seconds, but moments. I'd done this enough times to know when things were about to change. The plane dropped lower. The landing lights flared brighter. The crowd leaned forward as one, breath held, anticipation buzzing thick in the air. That's when the board leader turned back toward me. He shouted something over the engine noise, words lost in the roar, his face flushed with triumph. He wanted a reaction, an argument. Anything he could frame as resistance in front of witnesses. I gave him nothing. The plane was seconds out now, close enough that I could see the slight wobble as the pilot corrected again. Close enough that the danger wasn't theoretical anymore. I felt my heart hammer once, hard, then settle into something steady. Then a different sound cut through the noise. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just tires on gravel. At first, no one noticed. All eyes were still on the aircraft. But I saw it. A single black SUV rolled to a stop near the fence line, well away from the crowd. No lights, no markings. Two men stepped out, suits crisp, movements unhurried. They didn't run. They didn't shout. One of them adjusted a headset and spoke quietly into a radio. I reached into my pocket and turned on my scanner. The pilot's voice came through a moment later, tight and suddenly unsure. I have federal agents on the landing zone." The plane dipped, then surged upward as power came back hard. Dust exploded across the strip where it should have touched down, scattering people backward in confusion. "I'm aborting," the pilot said, louder now. "Repeat, aborting." The aircraft climbed sharply, banking away from the field. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the board leader screamed. He waved both arms wildly, shouting up at the retreating plane, his voice cracking with disbelief. "Come back! You're cleared. You're authorized." His words tumbled over each other, frantic, useless. The pilot didn't respond. Silence fell heavy and sudden as the engine noise faded into the distance. Phones lowered. Conversations died. People looked from the empty sky to the two men in suits, still standing calmly near the fence, radios murmuring quietly. I felt the tension inside me release all at once, like a held breath finally let go. The board leader turned slowly, confusion giving way to panic as reality began to seep in. He looked from the agents to the crowd, searching for support that was no longer there. Behind him, the runway sat untouched, lights still on, dust settling back into the scars they'd carved into my land. In the distance, the black SUV's engine idled softly. The cold stop had begun. The shift was immediate, and it was devastating. The moment the pilot aborted, the energy drained out of the field like someone had pulled a plug. Celebration collapsed into confusion. Phones that had been held high a second earlier dropped to chest level. Conversation stopped. People looked at each other, then at the two men in suits, then back at the HOA board leader, who was still shouting into the empty sky as if volume alone could undo what had just happened. One of the agents raised a hand. Not high, not dramatic, not dramatic. Just enough. The board leader kept yelling anyway, voice cracking now, words tumbling over each other. He accused the pilot of panicking. He accused the agents of trespassing. He accused me, finally, pointing like that would give his outrage somewhere to land. The agent didn't look at him. He spoke quietly into his headset instead. That was when the rest of it began to unfold. Not with sirens, not with shouting. With paperwork. A second black vehicle arrived and parked beside the first. Two more people stepped out, one carrying a slim case, the other holding a tablet. They didn't rush. They didn't fan out. They walked the strip slowly, deliberately, eyes scanning details no one else had bothered to notice. Lighting placement, surface compaction, fuel proximity, obstructions. Each thing they saw seemed to tighten something invisible around the site. The board leader tried again, thrusting his folder forward, voice suddenly reasonable, almost pleading. He explained about the easement, about county approvals, about how this was all a misunderstanding that could be cleared up if they just talked. The agent finally took the papers. He flipped through them once, not carefully. Just enough. These are forged, he said calmly, and handed them back like they were no longer worth holding. That word landed hard. Forged. Forged. A ripple moved through the crowd. Someone gasped. Someone else swore under their breath. The board leader laughed, sharp and brittle, insisting that was impossible, that lawyers had reviewed everything, that this was a civil issue. The agent didn't argue. Instead, he asked a single question. Did you authorize fuel storage on this site without federal clearance? The board leader opened his mouth, then hesitated. That hesitation was everything. Another agent spoke up, reading from the tablet. Unauthorized runway construction. Hazardous fuel handling. Environmental contamination. Falsified documentation. Coordinating an aircraft approach into unapproved airspace. Each item was stated plainly, without emotion, without accusation, just facts. Then the email came out, printed, highlighted. The agent read the line about knowing it wasn't permitted yet, about assuming enforcement wouldn't matter out here, about worst-case fines being absorbable. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look at the crowd. He just read it into the quiet. Intent. The board leader's face drained of color. He tried to speak, but another agent stepped closer, not threatening, just present, and told him he was being detained pending investigation into multiple federal offenses, not arrested yet. Detained. The distinction mattered, and it terrified him more than handcuffs would have. People stepped back instinctively as he was guided away from the center of the strip. Other board members were pulled aside next, each confronted with the same calm efficiency. One protested weakly. One went silent. One asked if this could be handled privately. No one answered that question. The plane never came back. Instead, the agents issued a formal notice of seizure. The runway was declared illegal and unsafe. Construction was halted immediately. Fuel drums were tagged. Equipment was marked for removal. The site was no longer a project. It was evidence. That's when people started looking at me differently, not with anger, with confusion. An agent approached and asked my name formally, like this was the first time we'd spoken. When I answered, he nodded and thanked me for my cooperation. The exchange was brief, quiet, almost boring. But it drew attention anyway. Whispers spread. The board leader, standing a short distance away now, heard them too. He looked up, eyes narrowing, searching my face. I met his gaze and didn't look away. I told him who I was. Not loudly, not for the crowd, just enough for him to hear. Understanding hit him like a physical blow. His mouth opened, then closed. The confidence that had carried him for months evaporated in seconds. He looked around, as if expecting someone to step in, to fix this, to argue it away. No one did. The agents continued their work. Photos, measurements, tags. The lights were shut off one by one. The strip, so carefully prepared, sat useless and condemned under the morning sun. Neighbors stood in stunned silence, phones forgotten in their hands. There was no applause, no cheers, just the sound of wind moving through grass that had been trampled and would now have to be restored. Before they left, the lead agent made it official. The runway was permanently shut down. The land would be remediated under federal oversight. Charges would follow, civil and criminal. Then they were gone as quietly as they'd arrived. The crowd dispersed slowly, awkwardly, like people leaving a theater after realizing the story wasn't what they thought it was. The board leader was escorted away separately, shoulders slumped, folder dangling uselessly from one hand. I stood there long after the last vehicle disappeared down the road, watching dust settle back onto land that had nearly been turned into something dangerous. The runway was finished. Not because someone shouted louder than anyone else, but because the truth finally showed up quietly and shut it down for good. The consequences didn't come with noise. They came with envelopes, certified letters, federal notices, civil filings that didn't ask for attention because they didn't need it. The fake easement collapsed first, torn apart by historical records and handwriting analysis that showed exactly what it was. A distortion of an old agreement inflated far beyond its original intent. Once that fell, everything else followed. The HOA tried to survive it. For about a week, then the fines started landing. Not symbolic ones, real numbers. Environmental remediation costs, hazardous fuel handling penalties, unauthorized aviation coordination. The association's accounts froze almost overnight, and the board members discovered something they hadn't planned for at all: personal liability. The protections they thought their titles gave them vanished the moment intent entered the record. The board leader didn't just lose his position. He was sued personally for the cost of restoring my land, the grading, the contaminated soil, the fencing, the damaged pasture. Every inch of damage they'd waved off as temporary inconvenience came back with a price attached. Watching his confidence unravel during depositions was strange, not satisfying. Just quiet. He didn't argue much anymore. There was nothing left to argue with. The HOA itself didn't survive the season. It was dissolved under court supervision and replaced briefly by a neutral administrator whose only job was to unwind contracts and return things to baseline. Meetings stopped. Notices disappeared. The signs came down. What had once felt like an unstoppable force evaporated as soon as consequences became real. The land took longer. Federal crews supervised the cleanup carefully. Fuel-contaminated soil was removed and replaced. Compacted earth was broken up and reseeded. Drainage was restored properly. Fences were rebuilt. It didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't perfect, but it was thorough. Slowly, the scars softened. Grass returned. Animals stopped avoiding the area. The field began to look like itself again. Neighbors changed too. Some avoided me for a while, embarrassed or unsure how to bridge the silence. Others came by quietly, without speeches or excuses. One apologized for repeating things he hadn't understood. Another admitted he'd trusted the HOA because it sounded confident. I listened. I didn't lecture. The lesson had already landed harder than anything I could say. At home, the tension eased in small ways first. Doors stopped locking automatically. The kids went back to playing outside without watching the road. My wife slept through the night again. The quiet returned, not all at once, but enough that we noticed it when it stayed. I thought a lot about power during that time. How people confuse confidence with authority. How easily paperwork can become a weapon when no one wants to read it closely. And how real authority doesn't announce itself or rush in. It waits until the line is crossed, then responds with precision. Standing firm didn't feel heroic. It felt necessary. I hadn't wanted revenge. I wanted the intrusion to stop and the risk to end. Letting them reach for something bigger than they could handle was the only way to make sure it never happened again. Some mornings, I still walked the length of the field where the runway almost existed. If you didn't know the story, you'd never guess, and that's the best outcome I could have hoped for. Not a monument, not a victory lap. Just land returned to what it was meant to be. Peace didn't come as a gift. It came because someone finally pushed too far and learned that the quiet places still have rules. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?